tell us, all of you, what does a supportive classroom and school look like at all levels of teaching? What are the key components, would you say? Let's start with Jalene.
Okay. Thank you again for having me. I think that a supportive environment for students, whether they're immigrant or non-immigrant, is one that, of course, provides a basic level of safety, physically, emotionally, socially, and that there are interventions and programming around that maintain that level of safety. Within the classroom space, teachers need to know their students individually and take steps to foster belonging, which Adam Strom talked about earlier as being a basic human need, and forging those through authentic relationships. In the classroom setting, students are also they're neither spotlighted nor ignored for their immigrant identity or experiences. And you have a curriculum in which students are, not only seeing themselves in topics and materials and things like that, but you're also giving them an opportunity to critically reflect upon the current moment and figure out their place in the world and how they can make the world better.
Cynthia, what do you have to add to that? What does a supportive school and classroom look like to you?
I think it's a delicate balance of figuring out what it is, what about our classrooms and schools are not safe? Because we want to enforce this idea of this is a safe classroom, safe space, safe district, a sanctuary city. I think is often that's something that's thrown around a lot, but unless there's actual legislative barriers for ICE to be coming into schools, for deportations to happen in schools, our schools aren't safe and they're not sanctuaries. And so I think understanding that and working with others, specifically educators, asking students how it is that we can support them to combat that. But I think it becomes a delicate balance because another way I think that educators can bear in mind the experience of immigrant and in my expertise, specifically undocumented students, is by not transferring the sense of fear onto the student. So one practice that I often see educators in both K through 12 and higher ed evoke is a student will come and say, I'm interested in applying to financial aid, but I don't qualify for this, I don't qualify for that. The educator will kind of like come in a little bit and in a hushed tone say are you undocumented? And that is already communicating to the student that they should be fearful, that they shouldn't feel comfortable sharing that information, and that the educator themselves is also experiencing a sense of fear from simply speaking to them about it. And I think it's not as easy as suddenly being confident and being more direct about these, but I think it's about understanding how it is that we're communicating to students fear, and instead incorporating and including in curriculum, in day-to-day practices, in the inclusivity of conversations, the narratives of undocumented and immigrant and directly impacted voices.
What are some of the things teachers should bear in mind, Candace, briefly?
In terms of creating safe zones, so I think they have to bear in mind their own position and where they're coming from, and really be investigating their own perspective and beliefs. I think there's a lot of work to be done about being aware of oneself, and then how that is presented and engaging with students, with immigrant backgrounds or immigrant families. And so really investigating that and maintaining awareness of the needs of those students in terms of, the fears that they are facing given all of these collective circumstances and the experiences they're already bringing to the table.
Speaking of needs and current circumstances, recent research has shown how many people actually lack computer or internet access now, and we see that largely in certain types of Hispanic communities and in immigrant communities. Julie, if you're with us, and Jalene, what are some concrete actions teachers can take to support students who, in this moment, who don't have reliable access to distance learning?
So my 8-year-old son actually goes to a school that I think did a really good job with trying to figure all of this out. Part of the benefit for them is it's a small school, and so they were able to mobilize fairly quickly with a plan that, you know, was very well put together and relied very heavily on technology. And I think after some time, they realized that that didn't work for everyone. And so they came up with an alternate plan or an alternate option for students who, you know, for one reason or another wasn't thriving in the online learning space. They came up with the idea of allowing these students to do long-term projects that were guided by a faculty member, and you know, the students would have check-ins that could happen over the phone and not just virtually. And that worked out for the students who, you know, didn't have, you know, for one reason or another, the ability to get online to do the daily check-ins and daily classroom activities online. I think that as teachers, this should, like a conundrum like this should be viewed as in the same way that you would an accommodation. We deal with this all of the time when we have students who aren't able to learn or able to participate in the curriculum because of either a learning challenge or some other reason. And so we think creatively about how to make that curriculum accessible for students who can't ordinarily access it. And so I think that this is something that teachers are used to, something that they do well. The difficulty is that, you know, we're in the middle of a pandemic, so, you know, getting the resources initially to the kids may be a challenge. But I, you know, just urge anyone on the call who is a classroom teacher who's struggling with maintaining contact with their students to think about this like you would, you know, an IEP, or, you know, putting, you know, just thinking creatively and outside of the box to address this.
Julie?
Yes, and I would like to emphasize too that there was a time before technology existed and we found ways to keep connections and communicate. So some of the things we did with our ELL population here in Eastern Iowa to focus on really continuing and maintaining those relationships, because that's critical here. Did some old-fashioned letter writing to kids with a self-addressed envelope so they could write back, practicing their writing skills and communicating and keeping the connection. Physically distant home visits, so standing on a person's front porch or talking through a window just to be able to see them and know that they're well and see if they had any questions. Phone calls for sure, and discovered an app called Talking Points that would translate a text directly to a parent in multiple languages. You can set it up. But yeah, just that overarching goal of keeping connections strong with the families and making them aware that you are there for them, even though you are not seeing each other on a daily basis.
Cynthia, how do we support the students who are directly affected by COVID-19? And I'm speaking specifically about those immigrants overrepresented in fields of work that are essential services. What do we do there?
I think so in New York, there has been one initiative by the New York State Youth Leadership Council to fundraise money. In all honesty, right now it's money that students need support with. So folks are trying to decide if they're gonna feed their families, if they're gonna pay rent. I think some states have initiated preventing any kind of evictions, but that doesn't remove the fact that they still have to pay the rent at some point. That doesn't remove the fact that landlords are still threatening undocumented folks with deportation if they don't pay rent. So I think like money, like if you're able to, if you have the capacity to, If you, I think in San Francisco, they did this. In Texas, I think they did this too. That if you're an educator or you're someone who is currently being able to be paid and employed and you receive the stimulus check, to donate it. Because I think folks are really struggling and money is the best solution right now. But I think also to your question about like how, if as immigrants are being overrepresented in essential, which folks are labeling not essential jobs, but like sacrificial jobs, because folks are sacrificing their health to work and to maintain this country moving essentially. Our students are also represented there too, right? So they're also working there. It's not just their parents. They're also like having to take up additional jobs to continue supporting the household. There's so many limitations to how to support them because of everything that mandates social distancing, because if you haven't already created trust with your student, it's really unlikely that they're gonna suddenly trust you now. But I think educators, from what I've seen, have been doing the right steps of reaching out, trying to connect with the students, trying to visit the students and socially distance in whichever way is possible if they have the capacity to. But I think my biggest advocacy for here is to donate your money, because that's where folks are needing support.
And Amy and Jalene, we're in a moment right now of where we have Black Lives Matter movements across the country. 1 in 10 immigrants is Black, but their immigrant status and their different history and cultural background mean they face distinct challenges versus African Americans. What should educators know about the experiences of their Black immigrant and refugee students?
I'll go first. So I think it's key to remember here that every student has a different life story. So we can't stereotype or assume that our Black immigrant and refugee students have a similar experience to those who are non-immigrant and non-refugee students. So I have the honor of working with several immigrant students from Ivory Coast, from Burkina Faso, from Kenya. Every single one of them has a different set of family values, different set of different socioeconomic background, different cultural norms, things like that. Some of them have been marginalized, some of them have not. So I think about similarities to, the feeling of what they have experienced in the form of discrimination from well-meaning people making assumptions. So one example that I can share is a student of mine from Kenya has remarked on more than one occasion questions he gets of whether or not he's a fast runner. Okay, so people will say things like, oh, you're going to go out for track. And he's like, no, I hate running. Okay, so this example reminds me of this question that you're asking. We can't assume that all students who are Black, regardless of whether or not they identify as immigrant or refugee, that they'll have the same reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement that's going on.
Yeah, I'd like to say that I think that it's important for, just as you were saying, Amy, for teachers to know their students on an individual basis, but also, check their perceptions of, what they believe about these students based on their backgrounds. I think it's very easy for people to look at a student who has an intersectional aspect of their sectional aspects of their identity as being more like one aspect being more prominent or salient than the other. And I think that that's a dangerous thing to do, particularly for students who are both Black and immigrant. If you are, like, I think about teachers that I've witnessed in the past who, may make a distinction or between their African-American non-immigrant students and their immigrant students, and, maybe place think of their immigrant Black students in a more favorable light than their African-American students, or vice versa. There's one teacher that I can think of right now, would say, oh, but the ones who are just coming over are so much better behaved or much more studious than the other Black students. And I think that's dangerous. It's divisive. And in addition to that, the Black immigrant student, you know, when they step outside of the school building or the classroom, they're just as likely to become a George Floyd as any African-American student. And then on the other side of that, if you're focusing more intently on their identity as a Black person, then, you know, you are not paying enough attention to the fact that this, you know, in this day and age in particular, being an immigrant, especially if you're undocumented, puts you in a vulnerable place with regards to, you know, your living, your ability to stay here, and a number of other things. And so, like, I think that it's very important to be able to look at your student as a whole individual with layered aspects of their identity, and key in doing that is making sure that you know your students as individuals.
And we will be actually addressing implicit bias in a little bit, but we have a few questions from attendees, and one of them, do you all have any tips on creating motivation among faculty, among staff, to those who are oblivious to the data and the discrimination presented in so far today? How do you get them involved? And someone else asked about, you know, teachers being overwhelmed with the expectations to teach both mandated curriculum and diversify teaching for every student's needs. Do you have tips for encouraging counselors and social workers to help support the needs of immigrant students?
So in terms of engaging people, you know, maybe we're preaching to the choir here, so to speak. We're speaking to people who already care about immigrant and refugee students, and so, pardon that noise. And so how do we actually reach beyond that? And in my experience, one of the ways that I do that is to catch in the small moments, in the details where it's evident perhaps that it is not a priority for that person, or it's not something that they focus on or have thought about much or are aware of, and taking that moment right there to share details about, you know, about the facts, about statistics, about what is happening and how they can, you know, I always try and pair, you know, the challenging information with also an action you can do, because then someone doesn't feel helpless, right, in the face of all of the challenges. And so kind of pairing those two pieces, I think, can be really helpful for drawing in that engagement so that they actually want to maybe pursue it more, or get curious, or figure out how to do something themselves as well.
Anyone want to add tips for getting faculty involved as counselors?
Yes, I'm thinking of one, Denzil. You know, this year we had a couple of newcomers at my school. This was the first year that the school had an ELL program, and so many of the teachers were hesitant. But once they learned the stories of these students and got to know the families, they were enamored and realized, you know, these kids want to learn, these kids, the family cares about their education, you know, they're invested just like any other family would be. So I feel like getting to know those kids on a personal level and getting to know those families and understanding their story, I feel like the power of story and understanding can go a really long way in getting other educators on board.
I think one thing that I'll add very quickly is just, I think for folks who have that question of how do we get other folks invested or involved in understanding and wanting to grow in this subject, I think also ask, has your school provided any kind of conversation about this? Because often it's that the conversation hasn't even started, and so if there is, we are assuming that folks may not be interested. We're also assuming that that folks know all this information that we think we know, and then are not interested in engaging with it. Whenever I provided these kinds of trainings in Arizona, folks felt that way, certainly because of the state politics. And then part of it was a questionnaire of, do you think this, do you think that? And we found that the majority of educators were interested in advocating for students, but just weren't informed. But I think with that in mind, if then there is faculty or students, or not students, faculty and administrators that are anti-immigrant, that are racist, that are not interested in learning more, I think it's less about worrying about them and trying to convince them, and more on focusing on how to continue advocating for students, because that's going to take away too much energy. I think those kind of conversations can be taken up by folks who are privileged, by folks who don't have to exhaust themselves in having these kinds of conversations, and who have more to leverage in these conversations.
And I have two more questions before we wrap up, and this one goes to Amy. Social emotional learning can be instrumental in addressing systemic oppression and creating inclusive learning environments. From an SEL perspective, what can educators do to support the immigrant students?
So I teach and coordinate a program with English language learners, and I have 9 learning outcomes that my students need to become proficient in each semester. And so 3 of them are school specific, 3 of them are general academic skills, and then 3 of them are social emotional learning outcomes. So you could consider adding these to your work with students. So the first one has to do with the ability to create meaningful relationships with staff members and a peer group. It's really important. The second one assesses a student's ability to apply coping strategies for school-related stress. Okay, and then the third one is all about how to advocate for yourself when there's a school-related challenge. So these 3 have been really important and have been really life-changing for me, learning about my students and then for my students as well. But I think it's really important to know and learn. I'm going to go back to how I answered a previous question, that all of our students have different coping mechanisms for how they deal with stress. And this could be, you know, from cultural norms, family values, things like that. So educators need to be really open-minded on how they perceive is the right way to deal with something that is social, emotional in nature. So I always kind of lead with open-ended questions. How can I help, or what do you need from me? And then I have them tell me how they want to work through one of these outcomes. So I observe, and then we ask, and then make sure that you're deciding on what happens next based on what you see and hear. So don't assume anything.
All right, final question. I think Jalene and Julie, maybe if you can give us your one top tip for, you know, it's a very stressful time for students. It's also a very stressful time for teachers, even looking forward to the next school year. Your top tip for improving wellness and self-care among educators.
I am a big proponent of consistent mindfulness practice. I feel like the more we are aware of our own habitual behaviors and thoughts, the more we can start to get a handle on them and improve our interactions and our thoughts about ourselves and others. So it could be a formal mindfulness practice and learning to watch the patterns of your mind, or it could just be, you know, being more aware of where your ideas and opinions are coming from. It definitely doesn't happen overnight. It's called a mindfulness practice because it's something that we continue to work on over time. I did want to throw out one tool. I teach a self-care course here for educators in our district, and we teach them a variety of things so they can have a self-care toolbox. And one of the tools that's available for free right now is a subscription to the 10% Happier app. They have tons of courses and guided meditations, and even you can communicate one-on-one with a mindfulness teacher. So it's 10%.com/care, and you can get 6 months free as an educator.
That's a good tip, Jalene.
Yeah, so I think that mindfulness is definitely a great place to start. And this is speaking as someone who's trying to adopt a meditation practice right now with limited success. But I think that what self-care is going to look like for each person is going to differ. And mindfulness practice and going inward is the way to identify what works well for you. So for me, I know a few things that I have to do to kind of relieve any anxieties that I'm prone to have. You know, it means that I have to move, I have to exercise, I have to get outside at least once per day. I need music. I need time to be my introverted self and, you know, recoup my energy after interacting with a lot of people. And so it really just depends on the person. But mindfulness is definitely the way to identify, to find out what works for you, and then come up with a plan to put it into practice. And one thing that I'll just mention is that teachers were stressed before the pandemic. Teachers they overcommit just by nature of who they are and the role that they play. And so whatever practices you identify for yourself to take care of yourself during this time is something that I hope will continue for you as we go back into physical classrooms, because we weren't well as a society before this. And we should take this time to figure out what does work individually for us, and carry that forward through the rest of our lives.
Thank you for that sobering reminder, Jalene, and for those great tips, Julie. This was a great discussion, so thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Cynthia Carvajal, Dr. Candace Black, Dr. Jalene Tamerat, Amy, Melik, and Julie Bradley. We will be seeing Jalene, Amy, and Julie shortly, so we look forward to seeing you again. But thank you very much for sharing these ideas and these tips for educators who, as you said, have always been challenged. So thank you so much.